Good afternoon. We are now gathered for the last panel. I am delighted to tell you that Mario Vargas Llosa is at this very minute speeding into Budapest, so we will have a keynote address from Vargas Llosa at 5 o'clock. And until then, we have an extremely important panel, which I won't introduce in any detail. I'll leave that to Provost Matei. Just to say, to repeat something I said this morning, I think it's very important for CU to never forget that in the midst of our difficulties, they're not exceptional, they're not unusual. There are other people in other countries and other situations that are much tougher than ours. We've had magnificent displays of solidarity and gratitude from universities around the world. Just as this morning we acknowledge the difficulties of Hungarian universities because we feel deep fellow feeling and solidarity with the universities in the country we're lucky to work in, we also feel deep solidarity for, particularly, if I can single out one particular country, Turkey. One of the things that is a great credit to the student body of this university is how early, how urgently they've raised the issue of the menace to academic freedom in Turkey. We have many Turkish students, we have some Turkish faculty here. They have felt electric anguish and concern about what's happening in a country with a great intellectual tradition. And this panel is a panel, and we will do what panels do, but it is also an expression of our symbolic concern for the fate of our fellow professors, students, alumni in other countries. And it's an enormous pleasure to have this panel here this afternoon, and we will go until a little after 4:30, and then we'll come back and conclude the day with a keynote address. I'll hand over to Liviu.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good afternoon. As Michael already announced, the good news is that this is the last panel of the day. The other good news is that Mario Vargas Llosa is coming, so it feels a little bit like, there is going to be a great concert and Scorpions is coming, and before, the main part of the concert, there is a local orchestra playing on the center. Not at all, not at all. Actually, I am joined by an outstanding group of scholars, and I should also say they are not only scholars, and I will introduce shortly each of them, but they are people with an outstanding and long administrative experience. They worked in their institutions and in several institutions, not only to manage internal activities of those institutions, but also had to manage relations with the state, including matters of academic freedom and university autonomy. So just to introduce briefly the members of the panel, Ayse Kadioglu, Nirmala and Catharine Stimpson. They currently work in Turkey, Bangladesh, and New York, Abu Dhabi. This is not one city, these are two cities, respectively. I try to pronounce the name of Ayse. I will try again, Ayse Kadioglu. Well, I'll try. I was born in a part of Romania which was under the part of the Ottoman Empire for some 400 years, but those Ottoman occupants, tolerant as they were, didn't force my ancestors to learn any Turkish, so my Turkish language is pretty bad. So Ayse is currently professor of political science, but also president of Sabanci University, Istanbul, and that is missing from the presentation, so she's running the university now. So in short, she comes from Turkey, as Michael already announced, and I almost don't need to add anything by way of introduction to our panel on academic freedom and the state. I would nevertheless mention one among her many contributions. She was a member of the advisory group of Council of Europe that co-authored in 2011 the report titled Living Together, Combining Diversity and Freedom in 21st Century Europe. Professor Nirmala Rao is Vice Chancellor of the Asian University for Women in Bangladesh. She is a political scientist and former Pro-Director of the School of Oriental and African Studies, the famous SOAS, at the University of London. As an expert on urban governance, she has an extensive experience of public service and has served as an advisor to a range of bodies, including the UK Audit Commission, the Prime Minister's Office, and the UK and the government of India. She will talk a little about Bangladesh, but perhaps more interestingly about academic freedom and the state somewhere between the UK and India, with a view to colonial legacies or their surprising absence. Catharine Stimpson is University Professor and Dean Emerita of the Graduate School of Arts and Science at New York University. She held many prestigious positions at some of the best US universities and worked with important organizations in higher education like the MacArthur Foundation in Chicago. Among her many, many contributions, I would mention only that she was the founding editor of Science, Journal of Women and Culture, Women in Culture and Society. Kate has taught for many years at, I wrote in my notes, CEU Abu Dhabi, no, it's NYU Abu Dhabi, and in her talk, she will refer to this particular experience as well. The format of our panel will be similar to the other two today. Let me note for a start that the other two panels focused on Hungary and the United States. There was a little bit of Europe, but the focus was on Hungary and the United States. And of course, this is not accidental. As we all know, Hungary and the United States are the most important countries in the world, and in this particular order. Now, seriously speaking, this panel will be focusing on a particular theme, academic freedom and the state, but also try to broaden the geographical perspective in the discussion about academic freedom, in a way following the lead of John Scott this morning, who took us to the Arab region. We will move simply away from Hungary and the United States. Allow me a few remarks by way of introduction to this discussion. And I should say that my remarks are based on a particular experience and are informed by my own professional experience. I am a higher education policy researcher and practitioner. As a practitioner, I had the privilege to work on quite ambitious applied policy projects on university autonomy in Europe, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. The overall question I am trying to address here is, in a way, how can we understand the relationship between academic freedom and the state so that we can put in practice or help design and put in practice policies that are supportive of academic freedom? I cannot answer the question fully here, of course. I will put forward only 3 ideas. The other way. The first one. When we try to understand the relationship between academic freedom and the state, it is helpful to make use of the distinction between academic freedom and university autonomy or institutional autonomy. This distinction is a contested one. Still, it is helpful, as it was already illustrated today in the session about Hungary. Traditionally, academic freedom is understood as the freedom of individual academics and students to teach, study, and pursue knowledge and research without unreasonable interference or restriction from law, institutional regulations, or public pressure. This is how Einstein defined academic freedom, and it is one of the classical definitions of academic freedom. University autonomy, on the other side, is of the institution, not the individual. It is about the right of the university to determine its organizational and administrative structures, decide on priorities, manage its budget, hire personnel and admit students, decide the content and forms of its teaching and research. Very often, when we talk about encroachment upon academic freedom as undue interference by the state, we are talking in reality about restriction of institutional autonomy and not directly of academic freedom. I wonder whether we could say, as it was already suggested this morning, that institutional autonomy is a precondition of academic freedom, or perhaps a facet of academic freedom. We can, for example, interpret the recent attacks against CEU in Hungary as being against university autonomy. The attack of the Hungarian government was not directly against the right of our faculty members and students to pursue the study of a particular subject or publish a paper or any particular topic of their choice. This was not about some kind of academic censorship. Rather, it was an attack against our university as an institution, about the right of this institution to decide on how to organize its work, its administrative operations, and governance structures. Matters of academic freedom are more salient in certain countries. In others, it is rather the institutional autonomy that is more urgent. In the US and Western Europe, as it was alluded to here, institutional autonomy is often taken for granted, and what is debated is academic freedom. In other countries, like in many parts of the post-Soviet area, for example, institutional autonomy is severely restricted, which makes it a more urgent matter to discuss and attend to. In Myanmar, an emerging democracy where CEU Center for Higher Education Policy does a lot of work, there is almost no institutional autonomy, which makes the matter of academic freedom basically irrelevant. For example, all rectors, academics, and many administrators are rotated. They are moved from one university to another around the country. The individuals and institutions concerned have no say on who is going where and when. There is no staffing autonomy. Curriculum is decided centrally for all disciplines by the ministry. Universities have no ownership over their buildings, cannot decide on student enrollments or finances. Because there is almost no institutional autonomy at all, there is no genuine research and teaching in the country, and for this reason, there is no discussion about academic freedom, although academic freedom is nominally recognized under the law. The big discussion in Myanmar higher education nowadays is about autonomy. In this country, it is the state that made the work of universities impossible, having deprived them of autonomy over many decades. It is also the state that is trying to change this situation currently, and for the better. CEU has been working in Myanmar with national authorities and 2 flagship universities since 2012 to reform system-level regulations and basically make autonomy simply possible. The second idea. Academic freedom and institutional autonomy are not binary variables. They are not unidimensional either. Academic freedom and university autonomy are almost always a matter of degree, and they are multidimensional. When I say this is a matter of degree, this suggests that there is at least some freedom in universities everywhere and at any time. By this, I do not mean to ignore or excuse the reality of severe restrictions and even repression of academic freedom and university autonomy in certain countries, going all the way not only to censure, but to imprisonment and even killings of students and academics, as I believe will be discussed here today. Still, it is important to recognize that in different systems and institutions, academics can have more freedom or less freedom, as opposed to simply no freedom at all or complete freedom. They can be free in certain areas, but not in others. At the same time, in particular systems, universities as institutions can have the right to decide on their own in certain areas, but not in others. They can have more freedom in one area and very limited freedom in others. In most countries, we cannot speak of autonomy as a discrete variable that can be reflected in a single index, but rather as a configuration or combination of dimensions and degrees of autonomy. This combination, and this is important, results from regulations and policies for which the state is usually and ultimately responsible, and this is not without consequences for the actual work of universities. Take China, for example. Chinese universities have large financial autonomy and significant academic autonomy as well. What they lack, according to very fine research by Chinese scholars, is the right to decide on their own long-term priorities and strategic orientation. They lack the so-called strategic autonomy. Overall institutional direction is decided by state authorities from the outside, from time to time, in ways that are difficult to anticipate for the institutions. As John Scott, who just went out, said today, citing, I believe, Dewey, Chinese universities are given something like powerful cars by the government and a lot of money to buy gas, but they are also given a map by the same government with only one highway. They can go up and down, they can never explore other avenues other than what is on the map. This explains, according to these Chinese researchers, an interesting phenomenon. China has overtaken the US in terms of number of academic publications by now, but it lags behind in producing genuine new knowledge that shows creativity. If academic freedom and institutional autonomy are not binary variables, not a yes or no, 1 or 0, does it mean that academic freedom eventually can be never fully repressed? This is an interesting question. Let's take the case of Russia for a second, a hotspot on the global map of the fight for academic freedom and autonomy. And I should say we regret the several colleagues we invited from Russia to join this panel were not able to come in the end. We invited colleagues from the European universities of St. Petersburg. But let me illustrate the situation and look for an answer to the question about the eventual impossibility to restrict fully academic freedom with two examples. And I will take the examples from the research of one of our students. And I should probably apologize for citing the work of a CEU student. Her name is Liza Potapova. I'm not even sure she's here. Apologize for citing a student at a conference where the main references are Kant, Dewey, and Wilhelm von Humboldt. It is just that her research is fascinating. And she noted, for example, that there are different types of freedom and they receive different treatment in Russia. Academic freedom is tolerated. Freedom of association is restricted. Freedom of speech is also severely restricted. Why is it so that the government tolerates, even encourages, within certain limits, academic freedom? And the answer to this question is her research, which she hasn't done yet, but it is basically because the government, the Russian government, call it a liberal regime or authoritarian regime, expects something from universities. And this is to produce knowledge that is good for economic development, for social mobility, also for symbolic reasons. There is a policy of the Russian government to have, I believe, 4 universities in the first 100 in the world by a certain time. And universities cannot deliver all this without autonomy. And therefore, Russian academics are allowed to exercise academic freedom within certain limits. As soon as they confront the government or challenge the government, that's the limit. But other than that, they can exercise their academic freedom. And we have seen this different treatment in St. Petersburg. The colleagues at the Higher School of Economics do wonderful research, publish their research. The university is flourishing. Their colleagues in the same city at the European University, they are not allowed to do what they wanted. So, there is something like a discretionary treatment of universities and academic freedom, but still academic freedom does exist in Russia, as it exists in other regimes that can be considered authoritarian. And I will give one other example. We all know about the higher education miracle in Singapore. These good Singapore universities have been created top-down with a lot of financial support from the government, but basically without any institutional autonomy. They were not autonomous universities. That has changed, again, because the government expected something from the universities, had certain objectives, and they realized universities cannot deliver without autonomy, and now basically all great Singapore universities describe themselves as autonomous. They almost have it in the name. Under the name of the university, immediately they say autonomous university. So, this tells us something about the degree to which the state can tolerate, even encourage and support academic freedom, institutional autonomy in non-democratic regimes. There's also the question, and I don't know the answer, can academic freedom be completely suppressed? And the example I have in mind is science in Soviet universities during Stalin's time. There was a lot of excellent excellent outcomes in conditions of complete absence of democracy, and we can ask ourselves whether people who produce outstanding theories, research, not only in disciplines that were encouraged by the government, but in disciplines that were neglected by the government, did they do this because they had some degree of academic freedom, which is probably something that we can try to conceptualize in terms of freedom of thinking. But I don't know the answer to the question, is it the case that academic freedom can never be completely suppressed? The third and last idea, universities need a state around them. They cannot operate well without state institutions and regulations to protect and make possible their work, including academic freedom and institutional autonomy. The state is always an important actor in this regard, even in countries with a strong tradition of self-regulation. It is also important in international education. The state is not disappearing from higher education in the age of internationalization, and I believe Kate will discuss such an example. CEU itself is another example. We are an international university, possibly one of the most international universities in the world because we have no national majority in our student body. Still, we clash brutally with the Hungarian state to the point that our very existence is at stake, at least here in Hungary. To address this, we sought the support of various national and international constituencies, and this support was overwhelming. But it might not work, as it didn't work in the case of the attack on universities in Turkey. All the international support changed nothing because the government didn't change. It looks like our best chance is another state, the state of New York, currently in negotiation with Hungary about our fate, and John Scott also mentioned this morning. At an international university, which we are, we need the support of the state to guarantee our autonomy and to a large degree our academic freedom as well. We cannot work otherwise. So what are the main lessons from this and other experiences, including CEU's work in other applied projects in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan? We are also part of the EUA autonomy scorecard that was presented here. So I think what we learn is something that might not be comfortable and easy to accept. It might also be wrong, I'm not sure, but it is a reaffirmation of the old Humboldtian principle. It is the responsibility of the state to protect the university, to ensure its autonomy, and also the conditions for academic freedom. But there is something perhaps even more frightening here, and if I am proven wrong, I would be only happy to accept it. There is no other institution, force, or actor in the society that can ensure autonomy. It is only the state. It is not the civil society. See demonstrations in Hungary, large as they were, they didn't change much. Not the international organizations, see the Council of Europe or European Union pressure in Turkey and Hungary. And it is not the international community or the court of the public opinion. See again Turkey, or I don't know, the situation in Serbia on Milosevic changed the higher education law. International support and pressure didn't change the situation with regard to autonomy. This does not mean that civil society, international organizations, or the universities themselves don't have a role and responsibility. But the key, I would say, is in the hand of the state. The state can turn it on and off. The second lesson or message is that if we want to address issues of university autonomy, to have better arrangements for university autonomy as a precondition for academic freedom, we need to engage with the state. This might sound trivial, but it is not trivial because it is not enough or helpful that we speak only with the institutions themselves, like international foundations doing capacity building in countries where there is no institutional autonomy and they work exclusively with the university. This was also a discussion at the Open Society Foundations for a while in the higher education project, when it was almost decided that this program will work only with the institutions and never with the state. This is wrong. Another question, yes, if we accept that we have to engage with the state, can this work and how? This is a long discussion. I would only like to say, and I'll end with this, that engagement with the state can work. And I will tell you one example. We did a lot of work in Myanmar, and last summer we were invited by the Minister of Education in the fabulous city of Naypyidaw, and he started quoting from our handbook that we prepare for Myanmar on university autonomy, the 8 dimensions. Don't ask me why we put there 8 and not 4 as it is discussed there. And then they put language from our proposal in the draft higher education law with regard to autonomy. So this is remarkable, unexpected, small CEU, eventually having an impact 7,000 miles away, but it shows that it is engagement with the state for the cause of institutional autonomy is possible. I will stop here, and then we continue with the colleagues from the panel. Nirmala.
First of all, I'd like to thank the President and Provost for giving me an opportunity to come here and be part of this wonderful symposium. I just want to say I'm not an expert on the topic, nor can I offer any grand theories of academic freedom, unlike my colleagues here who are real experts. But what I hope to do is to offer some reflections based on my experience of having worked both in the UK and India and studied in both countries. Forgive me for not speaking much about Bangladesh, because I've just completed my 100 days, very eventful 100 days, and I'm sure more eventful than perhaps President Trump. AUW, Asian University for Women, is not a private university, nor is it a public university. It's an international university. funded predominantly by individual donors, corporations, trusts, and foundations. And at the moment, it's been 9 years since its establishment, and it's enjoying considerable academic freedom. It's got trustees from all over the world, but chaired by the former foreign minister of Bangladesh, and it's got 2 ex officio members who are Education Secretary and Secretary for Foreign Affairs. Apart from that, we have faculty who are, nearly 60% of our faculty come from abroad, primarily North America. So I can comfortably say that AUW as an institution currently enjoys immense academic freedom. But that's not to say that other universities in Bangladesh are in the same fortunate situation. So as I said, I'll just focus on India and UK. And when I say India, I mean the Asian subcontinent that includes Bangladesh, which is not very different to what happens in India. Academic freedom is under threat in both these countries, in the UK and India. And the crises range from academics being subject to severe sanctions, including suspension, firing, imprisonment, or even violence. At the outset, I think it's important to note that in England, freedom, though no doubt just as real, is much more intangible than elsewhere globally. This is because there are no formal guarantees of liberty in the British Constitution. But despite this, academic freedom is always taken for granted. And freedom of thought and speech is the most prized civil liberties of the Englishman. But there have been growing pressures recently, which may be political or social, but not religious, as was in the past. Religious pressures were, for a long time, a more serious menace to academic freedom in English universities than were political. But for all practical purposes, they have ceased to be of importance. They were an outstanding feature of the middle years of the 19th century at Oxford and Cambridge, or even while setting up the University College London or King's College in 1828 and 1832, or indeed Durham University in 1832. But those who created the new universities of the 20th century took the view that universities should be self-governing, autonomous institutions. But in most European countries, as we all know, on the other hand, universities have been state institutions, and professors and teachers, either civil servants or in the last resort, can be subjected to state control. But with the return to quasi-normality over much of Europe, an uneasy academic freedom, as we all know, has been making a comeback. Underlying reality of state power, however well understood, in some countries, its cramping effect only too obvious. Pressures in the English context are changing. The rapidly increasing financial dominance from central government, including pressures of growing expenditure and pressures from the House of Commons, and more importantly, preponderance of business interests in universities who fund research projects, who reasonably cannot provide all the money without any strings attached. And although it's increasingly difficult to judge how far this imponderable pressure on the scientific and technological departments of British universities has become, over time, a menace to academic freedom. More recently, the changing nature of funding for UK research, in particular the dominance of the research excellence framework, the economistic approach of the research councils, and the commercialization of research, all dictate priorities and determine the nature of dissemination of research findings into the public domain. Likewise, the teaching excellence framework dictates the level of fees universities can charge, which in itself depends on how well institutions perform on a range of quality measures. As I speak, the results of the teaching excellence framework were just released this morning. The question I think we have to answer is how far the existing arrangements within the universities in fact ensure academic freedom. To the extent that the terms and appointments, conditions of appointment and dismissal of their staff remain in the hands of the authorities, they can seriously curtail freedom. The freedom of an individual teacher to write, teach, and research according to the dictates of his or her conscience depends, in the last resort, on his being safeguarded from dismissal, should one's attitude and actions become displeasing to the university authorities. So academic freedom depends much more on tradition, on atmosphere, on public opinion, than upon legally established rules. British universities seem nowadays more intent on monitoring and controlling the way in which academic staff take part in public debates. University of Leeds recently attracted media attention a couple of years ago for using its social media policies to reprimand a lecturer who publicly criticized the Home Secretary. In the name of counterterrorism, we see further regulations. There's a growing climate of self-censorship on campus, as well as a sense that some issues, particularly relating to security and anti-terrorism, are too hot to handle. More recently, we've seen demand from students for greater racial sensitivity and representation of non-white culture at institutions. Campaigns by students in universities such as Oxford and the School of Oriental and African Studies have called for decolonization of the curriculum and the campus. At Oxford, protests to remove the statues of colonial figures like Rhodes and Christopher Codrington, while at SOAS, the focus has been to remove white philosophers and bring the curriculum and reading lists in line with the school's focus on Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. They argue that they are too Eurocentric and ignore works by people of color. Academic freedom is also at the crossroads in the Indian subcontinent. The role of universities and the ability of academic staff to speak out on a range of issues has become a central concern. Power and control have become more centralized, resulting in a dramatic decrease in faculty autonomy. Instead of providing oversight and overall coordination, administrators are taking decisions, even academic decisions, with less input from faculty. Faculty who openly disagree with administration can be subjected to retaliatory action, actions that are generally supported by courts. One byproduct of this is the appointment of people to academic positions who support governmental policies. And this, we've been seeing a lot more of it since 2014, where the current ruling party has appointed senior administrators who support the political party and also support student-led groups which align themselves with the national party, who can actually silence any opposition on campus. So those who fall in line behind the current government's policies and those purged from their positions who do not necessarily agree with policies of the day. Although free press and democratic elections are the norm, free speech is circumscribed to conform to cultural and religious mores. Documentaries and films exploring religious conflicts have been withdrawn on many campuses after individuals receive threats. Controversial issues confronting society, such as caste and gender-related issues, frequently create a climate that manifests itself in a lack of support or validation for research. The result is that academics develop a sense of what they are able to investigate and what they are best left unstudied and unquestioned. Just a couple of examples. The award-winning book on the Hindus by a former president of the American Academy of Religions, Venti Doniger, is banned from Indian classrooms because traditionalists view the text as an attack on Hinduism. Another of Doniger's book, On Hinduism, was also placed under review by experts before its reprinting. This practice of either banning a book or forcing a severe backlash is increasingly becoming common. What one writes and studies can result in suspension of services, public controversy, withholding or suspension of publications, isolation, and even murder. I know it sounds very dramatic, but that is the reality in India at the moment. 2 universities in India prohibited professors from addressing the media after academics made statements critical of anti-terrorism policies. The Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen stepped down as Vice-Chancellor of the newly created Nalanda University because of what he perceived as governmental attacks on academic freedom. Scholars at Risk, the human rights organization devoted to the protection of academic freedom, has published numerous accounts of Indian academics who've been arrested, beaten, and in some instances, imprisoned or killed because of what they've said in the classroom or what they've written. So there is real fear of, both in India and Bangladesh, of vigilante action for unpopular or uncommon ideas in both countries. The curriculum in India and Bangladesh is another issue which is very centrally prescribed. Committees create courses, syllabi with readings, and professors are instructed to teach from the materials they have been created. If one wants to deviate from the curriculum, permission needs to be granted by the faculty committee and ultimately governmental authority. The result is that an instructor who wishes to teach, for example, Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses, or the recently banned India's Daughters, a 2015 document by Leslie Edwin about a rape that occurred in New Delhi, would be unable to use either. In cases like this, an instructor lacks the autonomy to teach what he or she believes is in the best interest of learning. In consequence, academic freedom is infringed. All these examples speak to governmental intrusion into the affairs of the university and limits of academic freedom. In the worst cases, as I said, individuals are harassed, jailed, or physically harmed. Academic freedom to teach and conduct research without fear becomes even more important in a system undergoing massification, such as in India, where the social composition of students in universities has moved from being elite, homogeneous, to a much more diverse body. And that diversity in itself brings students with different backgrounds, different ideologies, who have a very different way of understanding and shaping what academic freedom is all about. I think I just want to conclude by saying my own inclination then, I think, would be to ask, how do these developments alter the state's responsibility to protect incursions into academic freedom? Can an increasingly intolerant society actually accommodate academic freedom at all? And what are the meaning of formal liberties if the destructive intangibles can so easily erode the protections otherwise provided? With those questions in mind, I just want to say my own pessimistic bias is to say that academic freedom cannot operate in the medieval mode in a gated community. The intolerance outside will gulf every community, and the university will be no exception. And academic freedom and tolerance needs to be cultivated as public and civic virtues, without which these values will become even more vulnerable, and the shield of the university cannot protect it from the waiting assaults. Thank you.
Hello. It is a pleasure to be here at a university that has gathered all its resources to resist impositions in an exemplary way. You empower us all. I am here as a member of a university in Turkey, Sabanci University, whose faculty members have engaged in a number of joint academic research projects with faculty members at Central European University. We have published articles and books together and truly observed firsthand the excellent academic achievements of the faculty members here at Central European University. It's indeed a pleasure to be here. As I said, you empower us all. And of course, there are many other examples that empower us. I want to start with that good note because I am pretty sure I'm not going to end with a good note. So for instance, many other examples in the world, such as when President Trump signed the executive order at the end of January blocking entry to the U.S. by citizens from, Muslim majority countries. 17 prestigious universities, including Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, have launched, in fact, a legal challenge to this ban, and arguing that the ban threatened their ability to attract international students and academics they needed, as they put it, to meet their goals of educating tomorrow's leaders from around the world. the deans, in February 2017, the deans of the Yale Law School and the Harvard Law School, Robert Post, my colleague with whom I worked for about a decade, in fact, more than a decade, as part of the Middle East Legal Studies seminar, Professor Martha Minow, they published an op-ed in Boston Globe titled Standing Up for the So-Called Law, where they actually, it was in response to a tweet. As you know, President Donald tweets more than anything else. A tweet by Donald Trump, who mocked and referred to Judge James Roberts, who blocked the travel ban as a so-called judge. He referred to him as a so-called judge. And the deans of Yale Law School and Harvard Law School, they argue that the craft and professional culture of law is what makes politics possible. It is what keeps politics from spiraling into endless violence. By questioning the legitimacy and authority of judges, Trump seems perilously close to characterizing the law as simply one more enemy to be smashed into submission. And if we are to keep the rule of law, it must not be a partisan question. It must not be the concern of simply the lawyers, because the moment is not just about Trump, but it is about all of us. There are many other examples, like the president of MIT, Rafael Raif, the day after President Trump's election, sent a letter to the MIT community, in a way basically saying, we will continue to do what we always do, which I thought was an empowering statement. So they're all going to go into history, I think, in a manner that is quite the opposite of what Professor Jonathan Cole put us, today, some quotes, from history, right, that are quite the opposite of what I'm just referring to. So these are all empowering. It's wonderful to read about all of this, and it's very inspiring. But then, of course, there is the reality on ground. So first I want to talk about the reality on ground, the facts, the numbers. And then I'd like to put the dilemma, in front of you. What is really the dilemma that we're facing right now? As I said, I'm here as a member of the academy now, other than my university, in a country where academic freedoms have eroded and continue to erode in an unprecedented magnitude. In the course of the past year, thousands of colleagues have lost their jobs in Turkey. As you may know, there was a bloody coup d'etat attempt in Turkey in July 2016. That actually led to the death of about 250 citizens, most of whom went out to the streets to stop the coup. Since the failed coup d'etat attempt of July 2016, so not a year, really, it hasn't been a year, over 5,000 academics in public and private universities have lost their jobs. Some of these academics have signed a petition, they're called the Academics for Peace, in January 2016, calling for peaceful resolution of the conflict, of the conflict and an end to the ongoing atrocities against Kurdish citizens in the southeastern provinces of Turkey by saying, we won't be a party to this crime. This is what you normally expect from public intellectuals in the face of human suffering, and that's what they did. The state of emergency, they have faced purges in the aftermath of that. Many of them face purges, especially in state universities. My university is a foundation university. It's, like a private university. It's not exactly a private university, but it's founded by a foundation. So it's not a state university. The state of emergency in the aftermath of the failed coup attempt in July, was followed by purges in state offices and the academy. The biggest purge came, I just spelled out the number, about a little more than 5,000. 5,200, it's around that. I mean, there are various sources, so you have to look at various places to gather this data. The biggest purge came on September 2016 when 40,000 public employees were purged. And within that number, there were 2,346 academics who were purged from various universities in Turkey. So there are these cycles. You know, the last one was in April 29, a short while ago, where 484 academics were purged again from various universities. Now, all these purges were realized through executive decrees that are, as we all know, prevalent measures in states of emergency. And Turkey is in a state of emergency at the moment, I mean, legally speaking. After the July coup d'etat attempt, 15 universities with alleged links to the religious community, which is accepted by the state authorities as the main culprit behind the coup d'etat attempt, were closed, literally closed. Many colleagues were imprisoned. Some are unable to leave the country, for their passports were declared invalid. There has been 2 cases of suicide that resulted in death. My colleague, one of my colleagues, published an article in the most recent issue of the journal Globalization, which is actually a tribute to one of these academics who committed suicide after, being unable to find a job, unable to leave the country, I mean, the article is titled "How to Liquidate a People," so I just wanted to mention that. There is an ongoing hunger strike by an academic and a teacher. They have been arrested, actually, on the 17th day of the hunger strike. Their strike continues, albeit arrested. They're arrested, the strike continues. In terms of their health, they have actually passed what is usually called the point of no return. Their hunger strike has now, has passed the 100th day. It's been 106 days, I think. Some academics left the country either by resigning from their positions in their universities and finding employment abroad, or through sabbaticals or unpaid leaves. Some are unable to leave since their passports have been revoked. Some are persistent in staying. It's not easy to stay, but it is not easy to leave either. I mean, you are mostly, there are academics here. We have students. We have PhD students. They continue their studies. My university is the university where you actually have to have a very good score in the National University Entrance Examination in order to enter to that university. So they actually study for that for at least 2 years, and then they enter the university. I mean, there are some universities where, some departments are, because of the purges, they are unable to continue with education. So some professors are actually teaching beyond their loads so that the students can actually continue with their education. So the predominant feeling, it would be, I think, an underestimation to say that is this feeling of impossibility, frustration, and desperation, really. This is, what's going on. Of course, there's no doubt that this is not the first time in the history of the Republic that the members of the academic community are facing challenges. There has been many moments in 1933, in 1948, after the 1960 military coup, after the 1980 military coup. There has been moments like that. But then, of course, even, by the standards of these past, troubles, the academic purges that exist today are, of course, quite different in terms of the scope and the intensity and the magnitude, of what is going on. The numbers are incredible. Also, I mean, secondly, so first, the difference of what is going on right now compared to what has been experienced in the past is, first of all, the magnitude. And secondly, of course, the atmosphere of impossibility that was created because the state authorities annulled the passports of many of the purged academics and made it unfeasible for them to leave the country and accept employment offers in other countries. I mean, this didn't happen really in the past. So in the words of one of my colleagues, those who are purged from public institutions are virtually sentenced, the expression now is to a civilian death without trial. They cannot take up public office anywhere else, cannot be hired by private institutions due to fear of retribution from the government, and cannot seek employment abroad as they are barred from leaving the country. If I can put it in a nutshell, this is the reality on the ground. Now, let me try to, in terms of numbers, the magnitude, the feeling of impossibility that the academics are experiencing at the moment in Turkey. Now, what is the dilemma? I'm going to try to express the dilemma as good as I can, really. Professor Matei just referred to a report that we published. Actually, there were 9 of us, and we published a report for Council of Europe. Basically combining diversity and freedom was the idea. Living together in 21st century Europe was the. This is like back in 2010. Okay. And in the part on, freedom of expression in that report, we attracted attention, of course, to the problems in Europe in terms of, when devout believers in a religion, they can be deeply hurt or feel, that their identity, their community is being victimized in some cases. So what to do with the idea of, freedom of expression in such situations, which seems to be, at the heart of the problem in Europe. So I'm talking about not the ability to criticize religion, which is, there's no problem there, but to, hurt the feelings of people who are religious, which are two different things, okay? And at the end, the part on freedom of expression in the report, we basically said that freedom of expression should therefore be exercised responsibly and with due consideration for such feelings. But then we say, but it is not the province of the law or the public authorities to enforce such consideration. Okay, so, it should be an issue of public deliberation rather than issue of law. So I put my signature on this, under this report, along with, Timothy Garton-Ash was one of the members of the group who just published a book on free speech. In fact, we had a book review of his book in February in Istanbul, and the title of the whole thing, we called it Reading John Stuart Mill in Istanbul, which is a, whole, he has a chapter in the book, Reading John Stuart Mill in Beijing, he says, so we kind of took it from there. But, so from here I want to approach to explain what I'm thinking in terms of the dilemma. Of course, I have to say, I'm very well aware of the distinction that Professor Scott put this morning between the difference between freedom of expression and academic freedoms. So I am talking about actually freedom of expression right now, knowing that distinction. And when people who study the issues of free speech refer to setting a high standard in free speech, the referral is almost always, the freedom of speech of those with whom we disagree, whom we even find, to a certain extent, distasteful, okay? such as, always the example that I give is the British historian David Irving, who basically says that the Holocaust didn't happen, or it's an exaggeration. I think he says something like that. But then, of course, he was sentenced to prison, right, in Austria. So, is that necessary? Can you just maybe laugh at that and go on? So there is a tradition like that, to think about the ideas of those that you find distasteful, okay, that you completely disagree with. In fact, you kind of find laughable, maybe, Other examples like, the leader of the Freedom Party in Netherlands, Geert Wilders, who argued that Quran should be banned, for instance. Once again, one could disagree with him, but is it necessary to try to get him imprisoned? There are other examples. Well, one example this morning is Professor Stanger talked about the issue, the whole thing about Charles Murray. You can completely disagree with him. You may, but you want to talk to him. This is what we do. Okay, this is what academics do. And as President Obama said in the aftermath of the controversy over the film titled "Innocence of the Muslims," the controversy sparked by the viral viewing on YouTube of this film, leading to the death of 50 people, including the very tragic death of the U.S. ambassador to Libya. But what President Obama said after this was the strongest weapon against hateful speech is not repression, he said, it is more speech. So why am I talking about all of this? Is because I am trying to refer to this idea of fighting hateful speech not by repression, but by more speech, means not hiding behind the robes of judges, as they put it, but rather uplifting the process of what we call public deliberation, okay, which is really at the heart of what we want to do in the academia. This is, I think, if I'm not wrong, this is what is usually called in the US the First Amendment tradition. Right. The dilemma that I want to put to you is that, the dilemma then is to envision what one can do in a country, like Turkey, and I laid the facts in front of you, when one actually is a scholar who values the First Amendment tradition, okay? What do you do as such a scholar when you actually encounter executive decrees that lead to the purge of thousands of academics, closure of universities, travel bans for academics? What do you really do when your ideals and the reality on the ground are at dramatically different levels, and in fact, oceans apart, okay? How can you be a scholar upholding ideas akin to the First Amendment tradition in a place, okay,
I think we have the dilemma, so Kate might try to answer it.
So in a place where academics are imprisoned for speaking their minds and putting their signature on a statement against violence and for peace. So let me wrap up what I'm saying. I think I want to bring this to something that I thought was very important that Professor Scott raised this morning, the difference between raison and raison d'etat. Raison d'etat, especially, if it is under siege, you see, basically, that makes it impossible for reason to live, okay? And what I'm getting at here is, I am, of course, talking about the state, these are state acts that are leading to these things, okay? But then, there is also some kind of an acquiescence to that in the society. So that's what I'm actually trying to get at. So, I actually published a book back in 1998, I think, comparing the ideas of the concepts of will and reason, okay? And there is a lot of will, really. But, reason is really something that we want to uphold, actually. So everybody ended their talks in the previous panels by saying what to do. I think as academics, we want to show to the world that we want reason in the Kantian sense, we want to keep the channels open for discussion. We don't want to tell people what is going to make them happy, but we want to make sure they can seek their own happiness through channels. And what we want to do is really to keep those channels open so that they can seek their own happiness rather than telling them what's going to make them happy.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to end here. Okay.
As I look at my watch, I see we have together in this panel approximately 17 minutes left. I will take not 17 minutes because I want to leave some room for questions and comments, perhaps agreements, perhaps disagreements. But first, on my lanyard, along with my ID, I am wearing the great slogan of CEU. And on the office that I occupy 2 months of a year in Abu Dhabi, there is a poster in English and in Hungarian reading, "I stand with CEU." So like everybody else on this panel, I want to thank CEU and OSF. I want to thank you for your courage, your stamina, your resilience, your imagination, and the fight that you are waging for all of us. So thank you. And that, of course, is faculty, staff, students, administrators, alumni, trustees, and supporters. I also want to say I was a little flip, sir, about being the girl band before your great appearance. But if I'm going to be a part of a girl band, I want these two in my girl band, and they can be the lead vocalist and the lead guitarist, and I'll be very happy just to do little riffs as their backup guitarist. Now, Leon Botstein, the wonderful Leon Botstein, said all academics are there because they're deviants. Maybe true, maybe true. I'm not going to be a deviant right now. In terms of this conference, I am going to begin with a historical allusion. And I prepared a paper, but I'm also going to be cutting like crazy, so just stick with me. But this is the historical allusion. In 387 BCE, the philosopher Plato founded a research and teaching center. I think I'm the oldest historical allusion today. He located it in a donated grove of trees, a garden, in what was then a suburb of Athens. And the donor's name, you see, it's good to have naming opportunities. The donor's name flowed over into the name of Plato's school, the Academy, and into the rubric for all of higher education, academia. And of course, as you know, among Plato's pupils was Aristotle, who went on to found his own center, the Lyceum. Then in 86 BCE, a Roman general without sufficient respect for learning pillaged the Lyceum. And centuries later, in 529 CE, after Christianity had become the official state religion of the western and eastern branches of the old Roman Empire, it was the emperor of Byzantium, Justinian, who closed Plato's Academy. He was suppressing pagan schools, pagan books, and pagan icons. In brief, the history of religious and state control of inquiry is long and deep, and as Jonathan Cole has written, the defense of academic freedom is never easy. Now, what have we learned today together? We've learned all the techniques the state and the private sector, all the techniques they have for suppressing individual academics and institutions. We've learned about why academic freedom is dangerous, why it is feared. And I think we might stress a little bit more that point about what happened to academic freedom with the massification of higher education. That more and more people came into the universities, so more and more, as Jonathan Cole urges us to do, we had to teach freely about freedom of inquiry so that families would not be frightened about the places to which they were sending their students. I don't have time to tell you a story about teaching William Burroughs, naked lunch, and a Greek immigrant father phoning me up and saying, I am not sending my daughter to Barnard so you can teach her pornography. And for those of you who know William Burroughs, you can understand the importance of his comment. We've also learned together that the resistance to control is equally deep and far more creative. And indeed, when I was an undergraduate in a liberal arts college for women, I read Plato and Aristotle without fear and with much favor. And as a tenured professor in an American research university, I am the privileged beneficiary of the extraordinary struggle that Joan Scott helped tell us about that installed academic freedom as a bedrock. However, the subject of our panel is academic freedom in the state, and what I would love you to do, our moderator, is when I hit the 5-minute mark, come give me a poke. I teach 2 months a year at the New York University Abu Dhabi campus, which celebrated its 4th graduation in May 2017. There are others in this room who know Aziz, who know far more about the Middle East than I, others. So if what I'm about to say seems to you worse than blasphemous, if it seems inaccurate, I look forward to your correction. But something else we've learned today that pertains to what I want to say is there is a classical definition of academic freedom. This is the classical definition of academic freedom created with such agony and struggle. And in the classical definition, you have to justify academic freedom. For example, in Venezuela, if you close down all the universities, you're going to destroy an entire generation of doctors. And you can't abuse academic freedom. I can't expect my students to fawn over me and every one of my prattlings and blatherings. We've also learned that classical academic freedom is inseparable from some degree of institutional autonomy. And a final thing we've learned, though I don't think we've stressed it enough, is that since 1945, that classical definition of academic freedom has expanded. Bring to mind, if you will, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Bring to mind, if you will, Article 18, guaranteeing freedom of religion. Bring to mind Article 19, guaranteeing everyone the right to freedom of opinion and expression. In brief, professional academics now have a dual identity. They are professional academics who can call on the classical theory of academic freedom, but they're also professional academics who are political citizens. And I would suggest that one of the great struggles is not over the classical definition of academic freedom. The great struggle is over what are the rights of citizens, which are constantly being constricted and denied. Now, contrary to the stereotypes I have heard expressed with irritating frequency, the Gulf states are highly diverse amongst themselves and within themselves. The 7 emirates of the UAE differ among themselves. If I hear one more person tell me one more time, how was it in Dubai? And I have to say, listen, I was in rather more conservative Abu Dhabi, not the same quality of nightclubs, If I have to say that one more time, I'm going to start holding up a flashcard. And the Emirates are not Saudi Arabia. Their commonalities? They are the legatees of ancient and invaluable civilizations, but they are comparatively new, modern states that have ruling families. They've often evolved, these states, out of political relations with Great Britain, and they've evolved out of the dynamics of these families. They have a high proportion of expatriate workers and inhabitants, and they are Muslim. There are difficulties now that I could not have described to you 2 years ago. One is the price of oil, which is not what it once was, which means that the ability to create and support new universities is somewhat diminished. The second reason why it's more difficult now is that ghastly war in Yemen, being fought by a variety of bodies. You know, the UAE with Saudi Arabia fighting a proxy war with Iran and a group of rebels and Al-Qaeda in there as well. And the universities, like all institutions of civil society, are taking a beating, a physical beating, as well as a psychological and cultural beating. And the third reason for difficulty is very recent. The Gulf Coalition Council has split apart. 3 members of it, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain, joined by Egypt, are blockading a 4th member of the GCC, Qatar. And what the consequences will be for higher education are still unclear. But even before the June 5th actions, the splitting apart of the Gulf Coalition Council, a highly respected and experienced scholar of the Middle East could say, there's much worry about academic freedom in the Arab world. And the organization that helps to monitor what's going on is Scholars at Risk. And Nirmala, thank you for the shout out to Scholars at Risk that protects scholars and monitors violations of academic freedom. Jonathan is a board member of Scholars at Risk. I have the privilege of being the chair. When we did our most recent monitoring of what's happening in a document called Free to Think, the Gulf states were far less troubled than Turkey or Egypt. And in fact, in our 2016 violations of academic freedom, we only found 2 in the Gulf. 1 in Kuwait, 1 in the UAE, though we have long-standing concerns about some denial of visas, and we have long-standing concerns about 4 imprisoned scholars, 3 of them in Bahrain, 1 in the United Arab Emirates, whose physical health is in great danger. But the great entries of violations now, as you have heard so eloquently, are Turkey, Egypt, largely from the Middle East, Asia, some in Africa, and increasingly a worry about Venezuela. Now, the Gulf states are no more immune to the contours of the modern university and to the new technologies of information than any other region. So what's really going on that I can see as a non-expert in the Gulf states? UAE has one of those wonderful constitutions, but it says within the limits of the law. So one always has to ask, what is the law? And one always has to ask, and I'm a reader of Kafka's, I think everybody in this room is, when is the law enforced? And this is indeed, is it not, a technique of control? Never to know when the law is going to be enforced. Never to know when the law may ignore you. In my experience, some universities have a limited version of classical academic freedom. Look at the handbook of a big university, Zayed University. It's a limited version because the handbook also asks you to pay attention to cultural sensitivities and to the legal and cultural environment. with its belief in the Islamic creed. But there's something else going on. And you referred to this, gated communities. It's the carving out of enclaves. Saudi Arabia carved out an enclave with the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, familiarly known as KAUST. It's even coeducational. And when I read the handbook of KAUST, I felt an eerie similarity to an American research university in its guarantee of academic freedom. And I happened to teach in one of these enclaves, NYU Abu Dhabi. The current emirate brought in 3 universities as an experiment. One was NYU Abu Dhabi, one was the Sorbonne, and one was a scientific institution in cooperation with MIT called Masdar. The great credit to the government, there's an ironclad guarantee on campus of academic freedom. And quite frankly, I have never felt any violation of academic freedom in lectures or in the classroom. Now look, I live in New York. I live in Greenwich Village. I am never going to tell you that Abu Dhabi is Greenwich Village. And I'm sure that comes as no surprise to you. And the university has made its mistake. But I have never sensed within this enclave what might happen to academic freedom dangerously. And I see the good work that can move, not only in the classroom, but that can move out of this enclave into the society at large. The gated community has porous holes in the gate. But I am not a political citizen of the UAE. I am a transient, an admitted visitor with a syllabus. I do not pretend to be a political citizen of the UAE. What am I? I am one of those academics with a dual identity that can take advantage of classical theories of academic freedom within the enclave, but I can also be a political citizen of the United States, a political citizen who believes in feminism, who believes in civil liberties, who believes in LGBTQ rights, and a political citizen who is the beneficiary of the US Constitution and Bill of Rights. I have a dual identity. Don't have time to tell you about the course I teach. It begins with a code of Hammurabi, goes on to Exodus, stresses Antigone, does a little Shakespeare in Melville, does some Fugard, does some Jabbar. It's a global course, and it ends with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I would suggest to you that given the terrible rise of authoritarian governments, which we've heard about today, given that terrible rise, given the struggles, that we need both theories of academic freedom. We need the classical theory, and we need the new theory in which academics have a freedom of expression and of thought that is shared by all political citizens, though perhaps with a very special responsibility for inquiry, for truth, and for reason. You know, no matter how imperfectly, my last paragraph, I am also aware of the realities of visions. I am also aware of the reality of faiths, the reality of aesthetic worlds, the reality of cognitive dissonance. I am aware of the reality and malleability of ideas and information. I'm aware of the power of the passions, and heaven knows I'm aware of the power of appetites. I do, after all, study literature. But Plato, to end where I began, Plato was one of my tutors about reason. And when I first encountered the Phaedrus, I gained the ancient metaphor of the charioteer in his sweaty, intense, muscular struggle by and for reason. The same liberal arts college that gave me Plato also gave me Kant. Not that I pretend to have understood him as a freshman. And Joan, you set the pattern of quoting Kant. Let me end by quoting Kant. I returned to him in the contest of the faculties, and he writes, "Now the power to judge autonomously, that is freely according to the principles of thought in general, is called reason." So the philosophy faculty, I think all faculties, because it must answer for the truth of the teachings it is to adopt or even allow, must be conceived as free and subject only to laws given by reason, not by the government. So what is our struggle about? Why are we doing this? Wouldn't it be easier to practice self-censorship? Why are we doing this? Because whether on the large globe or in the smallest, dustiest university in a desert, in the most remote of the Emirates, no matter where we are, our belief in academic freedom, our belief in our defense of it, is nothing less than our subscription to reason itself. Thank you for listening to me, my fellow charioteers. Thank you.